This is the lecture on biodiversity 2, fungi and plants. The main topics that I'm going to be focusing on in this lecture are I'm going to go ahead and talk about fungi structure and function, and then I'll get into plant structure and function as well, to include plant adaptations, roots, stems, leaves, the structural hierarchy of plants, the major types and groups of plants, bryophytes, vascular tissue, ferns, gymnosperms, angiosperms, their reproduction and growth. As a first and foremost, fungi are highly diverse. Okay, so even though they are diverse, plants are even more diverse than fungi here. So fungi contain about 1,000 different species, whereas plants contain about 250,000 different species. Nevertheless, having 1,000 species means that it must be highly diversified. Okay, so fungi serve many functions in ecosystems. They decompose dead organisms, and they can also break down large molecules, which evidently results in the small molecules. So that's basically what's behind decomposing. All right, so again, great variety of fungi. Some are helpful, some are harmful to us, like penicillium mold, for example, which we used to be able to extract the antibiotic that they make. All right, again, Alexander Fleming back in the 1930s, 1940s discovered that this fungi could produce antibiotics. And not only that, but we could take advantage of that, mass produce, and prescribe to a patient with bacterial infections. We can use another type of fungi or fungus called yeast in order to bake. Okay, so yeast leavens bread. Otherwise, it makes bread rise in the presence of high temperatures. Okay, so bread molds, they spoil food, evidently not good for us, right? And that can cause the disease if we do ingest that. Athlete's foot, right? Again, another causative agent of disease. But fungi can also be a food source, right? Like mushrooms, for example. And speaking of mushrooms, here's the structure, the anatomical structure of mushrooms, right? So there's a few parts to talk about here. First, mycelium, which is everything below ground, almost like the root system, right? Notice I said almost like the root system of a plant, right? It's not the same thing. They're made up of different structures. Notice how mycelium is actually the way in which hyphae, which are structural units, fiber structure units of mushroom, extend into the mycelium, acting as a root system, right? Again, not the same as the root system. Roots are a little bit different in terms of tissues, right? They contain xylem and phloem, whereas hyphae, again, these are fibers types of tissue here. So this would be structural supporting structure for the mushroom here, again, called the mycelium. Then we have the actual mushroom itself, which rises above the ground. Okay, so this is a part of the actual plant, the mushroom that is visible, right? So you can see all of this mushroom rising above the ground, especially if you have a garden, right? So if you have a garden, you're probably going to see some mushroom growing in your garden. Now, another structure that's of importance here is the fact that the actual mushroom cap, right, has an underside which produces spores. Spores are the reproductive units. They're the reproductive cells of mushroom. Right, so those spores are released into the soil. And as long as the soil is beneficial and as long as there's enough moisture, then these spores go ahead and germinate, almost like seeds germinate. Okay, but not to be confused with seeds. Spores are cells, and seeds are capsules essentially that contain um, what's going to give rise to an actual plant, right? So they're different. Nevertheless, again, spores give rise to new mushroom, whereas seeds give rise to new plants. All right, so in both germinate. So this is asexual reproduction, by the way. Spores are haploid, meaning they contain one set of chromosomes, and they go ahead and through mitosis produce a lot more. Produce a new organism. Okay, a mushroom, if you will. Where are they found again? They're found on the mushroom cap, on the underside of the mushroom cap. Now, some other fungi can reproduce sexually. Okay, so what happens here is that the haploid cells of two hyphae, they fuse, right? They fuse in order to form a diploid cell. All right, so if you put together two haploid cells, you make a diploid cells, just like in fertilization. All right, so again, that is another way for fungi to reproduce. All right, so in the another reason why fungi have been so successful, right, on land, because of the fact that they can use sexual and asexual reproduction. Now, in terms of plants, right, plants are a little bit more complex. So the rest of the lecture, I'm going to go ahead and spend talking about plants. Plants have been around for about 500 million years. All right, 500 million years. That's a long time. All right, so that's how successful plants have been. Plants have two, and I'll get into a few more details on their evolution in a little bit. But essentially, they have two main systems. They have a root system, so everything beneath the soil is evidently the root system, and then everything above the soil is called the shoot system. Right, so the shoot system is made up of different structures, flowers, leaves, stems, petioles, right, meristems, buds, right. So those are all parts of the shoot system of a plant. Angiosperms produce flowers. Okay, so whereas gymnosperms produce cones. So those are two groups, two major categories of plants. Flowers produce pollen, and they also contain an egg. Okay, so a lot of flowers have the abilities the ability to self-pollinate, meaning that again they can fertilize themselves in order to produce a seed that is enclosed within a fruit, right? So then to attract animals, right, which are the vectors for seed plants. So the animal comes over, is attracted by the fruit, eats the fruit, swallows the sugars of the fruit and also the seeds, and then later on, as the animal digests that, so they go ahead and essentially release that seed through defecation, and the seed manages to germinate later on. Okay, and that feces that was released by the animal can act as a fertilizer, essentially, right? Hopefully you knew. I'm pretty sure you all know that feces can be used as fertilizer. All right, so now these are other structures of plants. They have for the most part, they have a vascular system, unless you're talking about ferns, which I'll get into in a little bit. Vascular systems are made up of xylem and phloem tissue, which are meant to transport water and nutrients. Cuticles are waxy coatings that help plants in preventing water loss, okay, excessive water loss. Leaves, evidently, right, they're pigmented, It can be green, yellow, red, purple, right? There's many colors depending on the type of plant and where they're found. So those pigments allow the plant to absorb sunlight, right? So which allows the plant to carry on with photosynthesis. And then lignin is a tough carbohydrate slash chemical that gives plants a lot of their strength. Okay, so the cell walls of plants are stiffened, they're hardened, right? They're enriched with lignin and cellulose, which again plays a big role in structural role and also in supporting them. So both fungi and plants have evolved together, and they've managed to form mutualistic symbiotic associations. Okay, so it's called mycorrhizae. Almost all plants need to be associated with fungus in their roots so that the fungus can actually help them out in absorbing water and nutrients from the soil, where in contrast, or similarly rather, the plant helps the fungi obtain sugars. Okay, so that's essentially how they both help each other. Again, the fungus in root systems of plants, fungi help in absorbing water and nutrients from the soil, and then the actual root system of the plant helps the fungi obtain sugars. All right, so where do the sugars come from? From the plant itself. Okay, so the plant shares its food with the fungi that's helping it obtain water and nutrients. All right, so it's commonly known that roots plant or help the plant be anchored to the soil, right? Without a good root system, plants could essentially be right. They can fly with the wind, if you will, if there's no root system. Okay, so if the wind is strong enough, it can essentially blow the plant away if the root system is not good, right? So therefore, roots are pretty important not only for support, right, and acting as anchors to the two plants, but also due to the fact that roots absorb nutrients and water. But then some other roots can also store sugars, right? So they can act as sugar sinks, which store sugars for the plant itself. Okay, so like potatoes, for example, carrots, and so on. Okay, there's many types. This plant here has fibrous roots and also tap roots. Tap roots are very long, very tough roots that reach deep within the soil. And then fibrous roots are not that deep, but they form complex networks on the surface of the soil. So that was, again, the roots. Shoots contain stems, leaves, and the reproductive structures, which are in angiosperms, they're the flowers. All right, flowers, again, are reproductive structures. They may contain egg and sperm to be able to self-fertilize. Another structure of the plant is a terminal bud, which allows the tips of the plant to grow taller, but they can also grow thicker, right? So they grow vertically, and they can also grow horizontally. Both types of growth, primary going up, secondary going to the sides, are evidently very important to maintain the integrity of a plant. Okay, so these are the basic parts of a plant. Leaves are for photosynthesis. Petioles are stalks that join the blade, which is essentially the actual tissue of the leaf, to the stem. All right. So again, the blade is the actual leaf tissue, and the petiole connects that to the stem right there. All right, so you can say that petioles in larger plants might become branches, right? But again, over time, in order to become a branch, then that tissue must have become wood, which is a lengthy process. It takes years for that to occur, but eventually that might occur in the types of plants which are meant to produce wood, because not all plants produce wood. All right, so now stems are the main structural support of the plant. Many petioles grow off of the stems, and again, it provides the support for those leaves. So plants are made up of tissues, and tissues are made up of cells. Okay, so just like animals, plants have tissues, or vice versa. Just like plants, animals have tissues, right? So again, we know that cells make up tissues. We know that tissues make up organs. We know that organs make up organ systems, which makes up the organism. Okay, so the same levels of organization that all life manifests. Now, we've already talked about plant cells, so keep in mind the difference between these and animal cells is that these contain a cell wall. They contain chloroplast, central vacuoles, and plasmodesmata, which allow for connections to other cells. So you can say that this here is a piece of another cell. Here might be another cell, another cell, another cell, another cell. Again, plants, some plants are vascular, some others are not vascular. Most of them are vascular, okay? In order to be vascular, you must contain xylem and phloem. All right, so xylem is mostly specialized to move water from the soil to the shoots. Phloem is mostly specialized to move nutrients and sugars throughout the plant. Okay, so back and forth throughout the plant. There's three major types of tissues to plants. They have dermal tissue, which is the outside. It's kind of like the skin, if you will, the skin of animals, right? So dermal tissue is a protective layer, right, that allows for gas exchange. The ground tissue allows for photosynthesis. So this is deeper tissue that again allows for photosynthesis and provides support for the plant. And the vascular tissue is xylem and phloem that transports water and nutrients. There's four major types of modern plants. We have biophytes, seedless vascular plants. So plants that contain xylem and phloem, but they don't produce seeds. There's gymnosperms and angiosperms, which these are seed plants right here. But then the ways in which they produce seed is different. Gymnosperms use cones and angiosperms use flowers. A little bit about the evolution of plants. Plants, again, are about 500 million years old, if you will, evolutionarily speaking, right? They came from green algae, which are even older than plants. Okay, so about 475 million years ago was the origin of the first terrestrial plant adaptations, right? So meaning plants that live on land. And then 425 million years ago, so that was 50 million years after the origin of the first terrestrial adaptations, vascular plants came about. It took 50 million years for them to evolve. And then 360 million years ago, seed plants actually came about, your gymnosperms and your angiosperms, okay? So again, it took from 425 to 360 million years ago. That's how much? That's like 65 more or less million years had to go by in order for these seed plants to evolve. Okay, so that's a long for plants to have evolved. All right, so let's see. Something here. Dishes. Okay, so now About 140 million years ago, flowers actually originated. Okay, so flowers have been around for 140 years ago, give or take, right? So flowering plants are your angiosperms. Non-flowering plants are your gymnosperms, but nevertheless, they both produce seed. So these two are seed plants, but the ways in which they produce seed is different. All right, so bryophytes are essentially your seedless non-vascular plants. Okay, these are your mosses. So these plants, they don't produce flowers. They don't have xylem and phloem, meaning that they cannot get big. They can't achieve vertical growth. Okay, so they can't grow upwards, if you will. Therefore, they must live in aquatic environments or highly humid environments because they need water readily available so that they can keep surviving, right? So the way in which they grow is by forming these films, right, above objects, above water, on the ground, right? Um, the adaptations that they have to survive on land is waxy cuticle layers that help them retain their moisture, provides them a little bit of protection. They have green pigmentation for photosynthesis, and then internal protection for their gametes and their embryos so that they can keep on surviving, making offspring, and so on. They've been highly successful with those few adaptations. Okay, whereas seed vascular plants have been a lot more successful, right? Because again, they have more adaptations that protect them a lot more and give them more of an opportunity, more of a chance to be uh, to spread out more successfully. Okay, so bryophytes produce and release spores. By now we know what spores are. These are haploid cells that that might that have the ability to survive in harsh conditions. Okay, so they don't necessarily develop into a plant. They don't germinate if the conditions are harsh. But as soon as these conditions become beneficial for the spores to germinate, then they will become a new plant and they'll give rise to a new plant. Okay, so thousands of years might take place before these spores can actually germinate again. Okay, so unlike other plants, right, bryophytes have haploid gametophytes, right? So a gametophyte is a part of the plant life cycle, right, which allows them to survive and reproduce and give rise to sporophytes, which are essentially the diploid state, right, of plants. So the ways in which most plants reproduce is actually called an alternation of generations. All right, so it's very important for us to be very familiar with alternation of generations because we carry on a modified version of an alternation of generation, but plants are actually a lot more successful at that. Okay, so what does that mean, right? It means that plants are going to go ahead and alternate from being haploid. So they're going to have a haploid stage and they're going to have a diploid stage. Okay. So, for example, starting off with the gametophyte. The gametophyte is essentially right here. It's produced by the actual plant itself. So through mitosis, it goes ahead and makes gametes, which are still haploid. Alrighty, so again, gametophytes are haploid cells that divide through mitosis to make other haploid cells. And throughout this stage right here, you're looking at a diploid stage of that plant. So now, after sperm and egg are produced and there's fertilization, then the haploid stage of the plant actually takes place, and that the diploid stage takes place, and that is called the sporophyte. Okay, so sporophyte is diploid, gametophyte is haploid. As mentioned, right, almost all plants have vascular tissue. The only exception is the bryophytes, right? Again, why is that? Well, because it turns out that vascular tissue is a lot more successful in terms of survival and thriving, right, in most environments. I talked about phloem, xylem being parts of vascular tissue, and sugar sinks, right? As xylem and phloem are parts of the root system and the shoot system. Some plants, as mentioned previously, have the ability to store sugars, right, in their roots, like for example, this carrot plants and potatoes as well, beets and so on. Xylem is very important in absorbing water, mostly water from the soil, and passing it on from the soil over to the shoots, right? Again, that's called xylem. But it's also important in transpiration, the way in which plants regulate how much water they actually take in, right? Because believe it or not, they must be able to regulate their water. All right, so now transpiration takes a few more structures, okay? One of which is called the stomata. Okay, so stoma would be the singular, right? And stomata is plural. So what stomata are is these microscopic structures made up of a few cells, which are guard cells. So here's one guard cell, here's another guard cell. Stomata open and close, right? Depending on the type of plant, depending on environmental conditions, humidity, the level of dryness, right? And the thing is, as they open, plants are able to exchange gases. Keep in mind they produce oxygen, right? The oxygen does not stay in the plant. It must leave the plant because it's a waste product, right? So the way in which it leaves is by the opening of that stomata. Okay, so now as it opens, the plant can also gain carbon dioxide, right? But then if it remains open, then water also leaves, achieving transpiration for the plant. All right, so now closed stomata does not allow, evidently does not allow these processes to take place. And these are very, very important for the plant, especially in places such as deserts, right? So our plants here, what do you think? Are their stomata open throughout the day, right? Or are they open throughout the night? What I'm showing you here, this is an idealized environment plant. Okay, this is a forest plant, if you will, right? Forest plants can manage to open their stomata during the day because forests have a lot of humidity, right? A lot of water. Now, in desert plants, there's these adaptations called C4 and CAM plants, CAM plants. They actually work differently. Our plants here cannot open their stomata during the day, right? Because they'll lose way too much water because it's too hot and dry. So they'll lose an excessive amount of water and they'll wilt and die, right? They'll desiccate, if you will, if they keep their stomata open during the day. So C4 plants and CAM plants actually close the stomata during the day and they open it throughout the night so that they can carry on with their gas exchange and photosynthesis and whatnot. Okay, so now that right there means that photosynthesis has to be highly modified in these plants. Okay, the fact that they open stomata throughout the night and the fact that there's no light throughout the night, what does that mean? Well, that means that they cannot carry on photosynthesis at night, right? They can only store CO2 throughout the night, and they do store CO2 in C4 molecules and in crassylation acid molecules, so that throughout the day they close their stomata and they can carry on with photosynthesis because there's plenty of light throughout the day. All right. So again, what I'm showing here, these are idealized, mostly forest, tropical plants, but our desert plants work differently. Okay, so there's different adaptations for them. Okay, so ferns are other types of plants that are seedless, but they have vascular tissue, right? So they don't produce seeds, they produce spores, right? And they germinate in and of themselves without the need for other interaction, if you will, sexual interaction. Now, the difference between these and bryophytes is that these have vascular tissue. Bryophytes don't, okay? So what does that mean? Well, that means that they must naturally contain xylem and phloem. And that means that they can grow a little bit taller, right? Actually, a lot taller too. So they must produce lignin and cell walls to keep their structures there. All right, so here's the anatomy of a fern. You've probably seen these being sold at grocery stores, right? They're very successful indoor plants. They cannot survive, though, in very hot environments. So if you were to buy one of those from the store and put it outside, forget it. It's not going to do well, okay? So they have, again, vascular tissue, xylem, phloem. They produce spore capsules where they actually store their spore cells that are haploid. Sporophytes are the diploid stages of ferns, and gametophytes are the haploid stages, right? They have roots, lignin. Fronds would be the place, right? The petiole, if you will, with all of its leaves. That's what a frond is. So here's the alternation of generations for ferns. First, they start off as haploid gametophytes. Through mitosis, they produce sperm and egg that are haploid, evidently. And then those fertilize, and through mitosis, produce a large plant, right? So after that happens, spore production takes place on the underside of the leaves. And through meiosis, those spores actually carry on with spore production. Spores are haploid, evidently, and to achieve haploid cells from diploid cells, you must undergo meiosis. Okay, so very similar in that type of process in terms of what animals do. Okay, so now keep in mind, animals are sexually reproducing organisms requiring a male and a female. A lot of plants, even though they might be sexual, they do not necessarily require male and female, but other times they do. Okay, so now we get into gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms are seed plants that produce their seed in cones. All right, so here's the anatomy of a cone here. They have scales and they have seeds. Okay, so pretty simple stuff there. So what we're looking at here is a coniferous type of plant. So here's a pine tree, if you will, right? That has needle-like leaves, right? So these would be their leaves right here, and they're needle-like. They have pollen-producing cones, and they release pollen using that, right? So that pollen goes ahead and interacts. So keep in mind that pollen is the equivalent to the sperm, right? So pollen is driven by the wind over to an ovule, right, of a cone. It lands on the ovule, produces a zygote, which is the diploid stage of the plant. So once mature, that diploid stage, right, that mature plant goes ahead and produces these ovule cones that ultimately, are able to receive pollen from other plants or even from the same plant there. So Again, alternating generations between haploid and diploid stages. Angiosperms are different from gymnosperms in the fact that angiosperms actually use flowers. Okay, so we have about 250,000 species, right, of angiosperms or flowering plants. Flowers are the site of reproduction of plants. All right, so let's go over the anatomy of a flower. Here it is. They evidently have petals. They have sepals. They have stamen, right, which contains an anther and filament. They have stigma. They have styles, ovaries, and ovules. Okay, so again, the different reproductive parts of the flower. So if we zoom in, right, remove everything else and just leave the reproductive parts of it, we're gonna see the embryonic sac. So here's the embryo sac right there. Here's the anther that releases pollen, right? That's the function of the anther. The pollen lands on the stigma in this plant. This actual flower contains both, right? The male, if you will, and female parts. The stigma has a long tube that leads over to the ovule, right? And that's how plants can achieve fertilization, right? They can self fertilize. Um, so a lot of the time this happens, but also pollen can come from other plants, right? And as long as it's from the same species, that pollen can be taken in order to fertilize that ovule right there, that egg. Ready? So seeds consist of dormant embryonic plants and endosperms. All right, so which is a food supply to the dormant plant. So as long as you give it the water that it needs, it's going to go ahead and germinate, right? And there's two different groups in terms of angiosperms. We have monocots and we have dicots. So as the seeds germinate, they produce these cotyledons. Okay, so again, cotyledons. If the seed produces one single leaf as it germinates, then it's a monocot. If it produces two leaves, then it's a dicot. Okay, so depending on whether they're monocots or dicots, then their anatomies are going to go ahead and differ a little bit. Monocots are going to have fibrous roots for the most part, leaf veins that are parallel, and then floral parts that come in multiples of three. So you see three here, another three right there. Dicots have, for the most part, tap roots and some fibrous roots. Their leaf veins are branched, right? They're highly branched, and they come in multiples of four. So 2, 4, 2, 4, and 4, so on. Okay, so now, as you probably already know, the fruit contains the seed, right? The actual fruit itself was the actual ovule of the plant, right? That expanded, right? It was the ovary of the plant that actually expanded, right? So what you're eating, right, in fruits, you're eating the actual expanded and mature ovary of the plant, which contains a lot of sugar, right? So these are complex carbohydrates right here, which we as animals ingest. So now we know what to do with seeds, right? But other animals don't think about planting seeds like we do, right? They simply eat the entire fruit and then later on go ahead and defecate the fibers that they obtain from the fruit, but also the seeds that they obtain from the fruit, right? So as they move, they go ahead and defecate, release the seed. The seed becomes embedded on the soil, and then utilizing part of the feces as fertilizer, eventually that gives rise to a new plant. Okay, and that's how plants are able to distribute themselves and achieve, the production of new plants. So we can divide up flowering plants, angiosperms, into three categories. We have biennials, perennials, which means that these are going to go ahead and give flowers. Right? They're going to flower twice a year, right? Or they're going to flower twice. Perennials can keep on flowering, right, every single year. Plants can evidently grow. They can grow vertically, they can grow horizontally, right? And the way in which they grow is they use these meristems. Meristems contain the tips of the roots, right? But also the tips of the actual stem that contains terminal buds. And these terminal buds allow for the plant to grow upwards, but they can also allow for the plant to grow to the sides. So if it's upwards, it's always primary. If it's to the sides, it's secondary growth, right? So again, meristems, and as they grow, they produce new tissue in rings, right? So those rings contribute to the thickening, right, of the plant itself, which innately means that the plant can essentially grow indefinitely. Okay, meaning that as long as it has the nutrients, the water necessary, then the plant's going to keep growing for years to achieve very, very tall heights, if you will. Okay, so those growth rings, those layers, as they grow throughout the years, are known as growth rings, and we can count these growth rings in order to infer in terms of the age of the plant. Alrighty, so that was the last point of the lecture. If there's any questions, be sure to send me an email or request a virtual meeting.